Good morning. Thanks, Caitlin, for the introduction. I guess, my topic ended up being managing problem plants or for pastures and rangelands. It's an area that I do a fair bit of work with. I've spent the last 8 years running the agriculture department for the county of Vermilion River, so no lack of experience with some of the weeds this far north. Also had worked previously as a range specialist and pasture specialist with Alberta Agriculture. So a topic that I do know a little bit of information about that I'm happy to share. So let's see. Okay, so I guess just an overview of what I'm hoping to talk about a bit. I was going to look at some of the problem plants in range and pastures, mostly for eastern Alberta, not covering the whole province. So look at some of our mostly noxious weeds that are more typical on pasture. We can, feel free to, bring up some of the ones that I've probably missed. We'll talk a little bit about brush management on pastures. Main ones out here being the aspen and snowberry. And I know up in our area for sure the last few years there's been some concerns with some of the poisonous plants. So I can talk a bit briefly on managing some of those. Sort of as we're going through, I'll probably bring up some of the management options for each species, but we can also spend some time at the end looking at sort of in general what options might be available as well. So that's sort of the overview and what I'm thinking we'll cover. I guess just to start off with then, Western water hemlock is a species that certainly here in Vermilion River area has really started to show up in the last probably 4 or 5 years. And what I'm hearing from, various places across the province, it's not unusual that it's showing up in, just in Vermilion River, that this has been fairly common. Western water hemlock is, it's an interesting plant. It's a native plant. The water hemlock plants have been present in pastures long before we started farming them. And it sort of comes and goes in cycles and moves, it's worse in some years and not as bad in others. Interesting part or the challenging part with the Western water hemlock is that it is extremely poisonous. The most toxic plant that we have in Canada. And for Western Canada, probably our biggest stock poisoning plant. Very poisonous. So part of a root, if a cow gets it in their mouth, can kill them. And one of the diagnostic factors with Western water hemlock is that typically if you are seeing dead animals, they're dying in the wetlands. They're dead 10 to 15 minutes or less from when they start chewing on the plant. And so usually find them going down right where they're chewing on it. So it's fairly toxic. Most of the problems are going to happen early in the spring because the whole plant is fairly toxic early in the spring. And it's one of the earlier plants to green up, so livestock go looking for it. The other problem early in the spring is you put out young calves with their mothers. The calves are busy snooping and exploring and chewing on just about everything like babies do. So there can be some issues with that. Later in the year, the toxin actually will be more concentrated in the roots and lower shoots. Later in the year, typically these wetter areas are not so soft, not as wet. The roots more heavily anchored in the ground and less likely to pull up. So more often a problem in, like, again, spring can be a problem during dry years when it, again, is one of the few forage plants available. It's a deep tap root, so it can keep getting moisture. Can be a problem where it's overgrazed and found just about anywhere. We'll find it pretty much in wetlands across Western Canada, whether you're in the prairies or in the forest. we can find this plant. It's a fairly distinctive carrot-shaped flower. There are a few other plants that look like it, and we'll go into a few of them in a minute, but that white carrot-shaped umbel is fairly distinctive. It does have the multiply divided leaves and the leaflets. One of the challenges for distinguishing it from other plants is that it's really only distinguished by the leaf veins. So in water hemlock, the veins on the leaflets end at the notch in the leaf rather than at the point. We've got another plant we'll look at here in a slide. I don't think I have a great picture of it, but the water parsnip looks very similar and it's not toxic. The difference between water hemlock and water parsnip is that the water parsnip, the veins on the leaf end further up into the point or the tooth at the end of the tooth rather than at the base. The other thing with the western water hemlock, if you are looking at the stem or pulling up the root, the water hemlock will have a sort of a yellowish, oily substance found in the root and in the base. That's a concentration of toxin. It tends to be fairly strong smelling, whereas the water parsnip will be, some claim, even sweet smelling. The roots are whitish, not yellow. Be careful with the water hemlock. So we have had several instances in Western Canada where people pulling water hemlock have been poisoned and died. So handle it with rubber gloves. Don't get the sap on your skin because it is toxic through the sap as well as through the plant. And so, that's one of the challenges. One of the other challenges with the water hemlock is it grows in the same vicinity as water parsnip. So one's deadly, one's not deadly, and they grow in the same environment in the same place and quite often can be found in the same wetland. And so even if the one plant you looked at, you're pretty sure is a water parsnip, there's no guarantee that the hemlock isn't present. Generally, the real options for water hemlock are based on management. Don't overgraze, don't put the cows out too early. If possible, consider fencing out your riparian areas and grazing them separately. I feel a lot better making that recommendation now than I did 5 and 10 years ago. This is an ongoing and perennial problem for you. Take a look at some of the sustainability grants that are available. So the provincial Resilient Agricultural Landscape Program, or RELP, has grant money available for applications looking at fencing out and managing wetlands, looking at off-site water sources so that you can actually do some of that managing. As well, the federal On-Farm Conservation Action Plan, or OFCAF funding, has similar grant applications you can do to fence out riparian areas, fence out your wetlands, and get some money. And if you're in an ALICE community, that group also has some money. So if this is going to be the best option to actually create riparian pastures you can manage separately, have a look at whether or not you can get some funding for options. If there are just a few plants, pulling can be an option. Again, just be careful where you're managing it. Herbicide control can be an option. The water hemlock is fairly sensitive to herbicides, can be controlled with glyphosate, can be controlled with 2,4-D or MCPA, or some of the stronger herbicides. Usually the challenge with herbicide control is the location. So the water hemlock's going to grow along the riparian area. It's usually sort of pugged out and rough. It's surrounded by willows, not an easy place to spray. Over and above that, in Alberta, the Environmental Code of Practice restricts herbicide application by blanket spraying to within 30 meters of water, spot spraying with select herbicides to within 10 meters of water. So again, Generally, spraying water hemlock is not, not something I can recommend as a legal practice. But I mean, it's certainly where it works. There's some herbicide options. A couple other plants that have that same white umbel flower. The cow parsnip is another one we'll commonly see. Generally likes a little bit more moisture than the water hemlock, but shows up again in the same place. The leaves are very different. You can see they're a great big wide leaf, more of a sort of a rhubarb type leaf. Cow parsnip is not poisonous. Some sources even say that it's edible. It tends not to be palatable. So it's generally just the flowers look sort of similar and grows in the same area. This one's often confused or mistaken for giant hogweed. Giant hogweed's a weed that hasn't yet been found in Alberta, but an invasive that's probably going to show up eventually. Giant hogweed looks a lot like the cow parsnip, but cow parsnip on steroids. Cow parsnip would typically be, half an adult human's height to adult height. The hogweed can be twice that or more, and so tends to be a different plant. Now, hogweeds, it can be poisonous, but again, not known to be present yet. So that's the water hemlock, sort of our serious poisoning plant. The other one that can be a concern, probably less of a concern as we start getting moisture again, if we're moving out of the drought, more of a concern in drought, is actually seaside arrowgrass. Seaside arrowgrass is also going to grow in the riparian areas, the wetlands. Seaside arrowgrass, though, really prefers the saline wetlands. Doesn't require them, but is more common in saline wetlands. And this one is somewhat palatable. Cows can eat it, and so again, early spring during a drought, in the fall, it can cause some stock poisoning. Tends to, they do have to eat a little more, but it's still less than 0.5% of body weight in one feeding can be fatal. It says this one's a cyanide poisoning when they do get into it. And it's leafy. The plant in the center is a common plantain. It's not poisonous, but the seaside arrowgrass will have very similar stalk or flower stalk as the plantain, but the leaves are quite different. Seaside arrowgrass, again, it can be controlled with some of the range and pasture herbicides, but often isn't growing in a place where it's applicable for herbicide control. And so it can cause some challenges. We don't get as many poisonings as we do with the water hemlock, but can be a problem. Tends to not be toxic, this one can still be toxic in hay. The water hemlock, as it dries down, the toxins tend to concentrate in the root. This one, they'll stay up in the stems as well. And that was the limit of what I was going to go over for stock poisoning plants. Certainly there are more, and if you've got any questions, we can cover them later on. I was just going to move into some of the weedy species that can cause some problems. Probably our biggest noxious weed problem on eastern Alberta pastures tends to be leafy spurge. And it's a problem just because it is very hard to control. Leafy spurge is listed as a noxious weed in Alberta, which means that the Alberta Act requires landowners to control it from spreading. Fortunately, you don't have to eradicate it because that is extremely difficult once you have more than a few plants. It's often found on pastures, rangelands, it's river valleys, it's parks. You can see this one is, it's got a very finely divided, small narrow leaves running alternate up the stem. The flower actually doesn't have any true petals. You just get the yellow bracts. They're kind of a greenish yellow flower, tend to be mostly inconspicuous. They kind of show up a bit sort of right in the middle of blooming, but really a greenish flower. So they hide really well in the grass and gradually take over. Leafy spurge, if you break open the stem or to some degree the leaves, there is a white milky sap inside, kind of like a dandelion sap. The leafy spurge sap is an irritant, so it can cause irritation or rash in humans from handling it. It's an irritant to most livestock, which is one of the reasons leafy spurge doesn't get grazed terribly well. Cows quit grazing within the patch, so once it gets established, they start going around it. And just the leaves can look similar to toad flax before it flowers. After it flowers, they're fairly distinct. But again, the white milky sap is a leafy spurge problem more than or the toad flax doesn't have the sap. Control, generally tricky. If you are spraying, you're generally looking at a picloram treatment when it's flowering. So Tordon 22K or Grazon tend to be the options for control if you're going to a herbicide control. For small patches, glyphosate will work when the spurge is actively growing. Challenge, of course, with glyphosate is it takes everything out around it, and so there is no competition coming back. Cows generally don't eat the spurge, they'll move out of it. You can train sheep and goats to eat it, and there are a number of places where there are goat herds that will come in and graze leafy spurge and try and maintain the control, particularly some of the river valleys and riparian areas, some of the parks. We do have some fairly good biocontrol agents for leafy spurge in Alberta. There are some beetles that have been relatively effective in controlling spread of leafy spurge. Depending on your area, they do need a big enough patch to sort of support the population. Problem with the biocontrol is the beetles will never eradicate it. They eat it down to a low number and then run out of food, and the beetle population drops off and the spurge comes back. And so it sort of cycles into a maintenance mode, but it can be held. But this is one, if you do have leafy spurge, try and get at it sooner than later. Once it's on starting to cover acres, it tends to be expensive and hard to control. And it's a problem one. Another one sort of comes to mind in our area for a problem is the common tansy. Tansy is quite visible once you know what you're looking for, particularly once it starts to bloom. It's another noxious weed in Alberta. It was introduced as a sort of ornamental medicinal plant from Europe. So often starts in some of the old homesteads and then spreads nicely from there. Tansy has it's sort of a bright yellowish orange button-like flower. It's actually a daisy family. It's a daisy flower, but it doesn't have any petals. All it has is the yellow center to the flower. The leaves are divided into leaflets. They're kind of fern-like and alternate with toothed margins. The plants themselves tend to be fairly tall, anywhere from a foot to a couple of meters tall, and fairly woody stems. So they stand up and show up for several years once they're present. So you can see them in the winter. Those, the dead stalks stay behind. The leaves are in there. Very distinctive odor. So once you've found the tansy and smell it, it does have a distinctive scent to it as well, especially when it's rubbed or driven over or crushed. Tansy can be mildly toxic to livestock and humans. Not that palatable. Cattle don't tend to eat it, but if that's all that there is available, it can cause some problems. Generally, because it's not palatable, herbicide control or cultivation tends to be the main option that we have. once this gets near water, riparian areas or into the trees, the herbicide control gets a lot trickier because we're dealing with a broadleaf herbicide that's limited by the environmental protection guide to where you can apply by water, and in trees, I mean, anything you apply will kill your trees, kill the other vegetation as well. So it's a bit of a challenge, but with some of the range and pasture herbicides, this can be controlled. It's on the label for reclaim. It's on the label for true range or graze on. We'll all control it. Ideally spray early from the starting rosette to bolting for the best control. It tends to not absorb as much herbicide later on in the year. But this is one that can basically start crowding out your pasture grasses and take over as well. Depending on where you're at in eastern Alberta, the oxeye daisy can be a problem. So it's a significant problem as you go further west. It tends not to be quite as drought tolerant as some of these other weeds, but certainly, I mean, can grow in all of the areas that we're still dealing with beyond extreme southern Alberta. Oxeye daisy, it's another noxious weed in Alberta, so required to prevent it from spreading. It's an introduced plant, generally, or started out as an ornamental. You can see why, it's quite pretty. And it tends to spread fairly aggressively. It can outcompete most pasture and rangeland species and spread fairly aggressively once it's established. Spreads by a small creeping root and fairly well by seed. And tends to sneak under the radar a bit because it's really pretty. It looks really nice. It can't be that big of a problem up until it is. So this one's one of our two problem daisies. It's got the bigger flower. They tend to be 2 to 5 centimeters in diameter. We've got one flower per stem. So it's the daisy that feels like you should pick it and put it into a bouquet. It's not multiple like chamomile. Most of the leaves are basal and kind of spoon-shaped or toothed, but not divided. It does have some smaller leaves running up the stem. Control on this one as well tends to be spraying before it's flowering. Can mow or deadhead to prevent seed set if it's sort of in a more ornamental area. But again, looking at it's fairly easy to kill. So the restore, reclaim, true range, graze on will control it. Glyphosate or dicamba can also be options. Can be controlled by cultivation if it's in a tame pasture setting. Oops, I'll go back to that one. But just, yeah, don't let it get away on you because it tends to be fairly aggressive. Just a word, the Shasta daisy that you can still buy in the horticulture centers for ornamentals is a hybrid oxeye daisy. The Shasta daisy itself, as the hybrid is not as competitive as the oxeye daisy. But one of the things with genetics is if the two, when the hybrids start producing seed, they tend to revert to the parent type. So the plant that's bought at the greenhouse doesn't spread too crazily, but if it goes to seed, the seedlings that produced can be they're as likely to be oxeye daisy as they are to be a Shasta daisy. So it tends to take off and spread that way, just because they won't, unless you prevent it from going seed, it doesn't stay and behave. So our other problem daisy tends to be scentless chamomile. Often a problem on some of our pastures and roadsides, can move into some of the rangeland. It tends to like to establish in a disturbance, but once it's established, it can go fairly well. So this one's also a daisy flower. You'll have multiple flowers per stem. We've got the finely divided leaves that are typical of chamomile. And I mean, it can be fairly tall or fairly big. You can see plants that are 3 to 4 feet tall and take an entire garbage bag to try and stuff them in and dispose of them. This one's really flexible. I've also seen it mowing below the height of the lawnmower or flowering below the height of the lawnmower. So it can produce seeds at 2 inches tall or a 1.5 meters tall. It's not real fussy. This is grow as an annual, biennial, or perennial. So the year it starts growing, it can produce viable seed. Each flower can produce hundreds of seeds. Each plant can produce thousands of seeds. And the nice thing with the scentless chamomile is that as soon as you can recognize that it has a flower out, if you pull it and drop it on the ground then or break it off, that flower will continue to produce viable seed. So it spreads really aggressively by seed. Best control is to pull it before it flowers, pull and bag the flowers, take it to the landfill. Don't just leave them behind. If you can pull it before it flowers, you might get ahead of it. Doesn't have a creeping root, so it comes out fairly easily in moist soil or sandy soil, and that will kill that plant. Mowing helps, but it will come back and reflower at a shorter height. Tillage can work. Generally, again, the herbicide control can work. So some of the glyphosate products will kill it. Problem is the seed bank. So it takes multiple years. The other option, again, is to move into some of our pasture herbicides with a soil residual. So the reclaim, restore, true range, and then you'll get some control on seedlings coming back. Cultivation kills the plants, but you still have your seed bank, and so you can remove it in crop. We have some better herbicide options in crop, or tillage will work, but again, we've got the challenges with that long-lived seed bank. Couple of lookalikes for pastures and rangelands in particular. We just talked about 2 daisies. There are native daisies out on our rangelands that are providing food for pollinators that are, just looking nice out there. So the fleabane is present on many of our pastures. So it's a daisy. It's just got the really fine petals. And so it looks a little different. They can be white, they can be pink, they can be a little, really pale blue. And then we've got some asters. Many of our asters are purple, but the white prairie aster showing here it's a little white daisy, but it a very different growth form, and most commonly just on our natives or older pastures. These two aren't going to cause you any grief. They're out there just moving nutrients around in the soil and feeding insects. Toadflax is another provincial noxious weed. This one's another one we can find on pastures and rangelands and roadsides. Will grow in crop, but again, with the soil disturbance and some better herbicides in crop, we don't see it as commonly. Toadflax looks a lot like the leafy spurge in that it's got the sort of narrow stem, the alternate fine leaves, tends to be, really smooth, kind of a shiny texture to it. That's the biggest problem with toadflax is it tends to have a really waxy leaf. So it's quite difficult to get herbicide to absorb into the toadflax. Again, introduced as an ornamental, it's a really pretty little wild snapdragon and outcompetes pasture grasses, quite aggressive, unpalatable, sort of takes over and moves. The toadflax, if you remember, does not have a milky sap. And so it's not a skin irritant. It's just a flower. This is the common toadflax. Some areas also have Dalmatian toadflax, which is also a noxious weed. The Dalmatian toadflax tends to be bigger and showier, has wider leaves that clasp the stem. This one spreads probably most readily by rhizomes, creeping rhizomes, by root fragments. It's a fairly aggressively creeping plant, but it can also spread quite well from seed. And so it's just, very well adapted to move in and take over. Long-term control generally tends to be the herbicides and often a residual herbicide to stop the suckers who are coming up from below to stop the seed growth. Long-term control for reclaim tends to be the, reclaim or Grazon tend to be the options for this one. And with those two, your best control tends to come while it's blooming. So spraying in early to mid-August. It is our True Range is registered for toadflax, and in that case, they're finding better control just prior to blooming. So the True Range tends to be slower to absorb into the plants and slower acting, and works better if you can get it on a little earlier. So those tend to be the control for toadflax. Baby's breath is one that I've thrown in there. The areas that have it. The areas that don't, good luck. Baby's breath is an escaped perennial that is a noxious weed in Alberta. It tends to be a bigger problem in drier areas, sandier soils. It's quite aggressive in sandy soils. But can be a problem in rangeland or pastures, can be a problem on roadsides. Up here in Vermilion River, where we're just starting to find the baby's breath showing up, you can or more commonly will find it either by towns or hamlets or by cemeteries. So perennial baby's breath is still sold in flower arrangements, and some of those flower arrangements can go ahead and set seed and blow and create the baby's breath. It's really pretty little plant while it's in full bloom. Week later, it's just kind of a stemmy, dead-looking thing that produces many seeds. It's a perennial, will keep coming back. The mature plants dry and break off and roll like a tumbleweed, so it spreads quite readily that way. The original plant has an extremely deep, extremely big taproot. I've seen them up to 4 to 5 inches in diameter, and I couldn't tell you how deep these taproots are going because there's not a chance of a shovel going down that deep. But the main plant will live quite a while. The seeds are the main way of spread. This one tends to be hard to control with herbicides just because it's got really tiny leaves. They tend to be waxy. Can be managed by cultivation if that's an option where you're working. Otherwise, again, looking at either reclaim or Tordon 22K, so significant herbicide control to try and get it into that leafy waxy stem. If you just have a few plants, you can take out the taproot. If you get down 6 or 8 inches with a shovel and cut it off, you can take the crown, and they tend to regrow much more slowly next time, and you can get on top of a few plants, but it's something to watch out for sure. Absinthe wormwood is a weed that is not on the Provincial Weed Act in Alberta, except in municipalities where it has been elevated by a municipal bylaw. So I know County of Stettler and Flagstaff County have made absinthe wormwood a noxious weed. Paint Earth County and Vermilion River are watching it but haven't yet elevated it. So absinthe wormwood it's a sage, but it's not a native sage. It's an introduced sage. It's an escaped. I don't know if it's an ornamental or a medicinal. But looks like a sage. It has a very strong, generally unpleasant scent. It's not a sage scent. Formerly used to be the flavoring in the absinthe liquor. But it looks like the native sages. Tends to be a really woody base, multiple stems. You get a large bushy plant. Again, generally you see the remnants of the plant through the winter. They stay there, come back in that same plant. It can be fairly aggressive. It does spread by seed only, but a prolific seed producer and hard to control. You have really hairy leaves in this case, so again, doesn't tend to absorb herbicide as well as you'd think, and and prolific seed producer, as well, because it wasn't on the Weed Act in a lot of places. It sort of got ahead of control, where you're often dealing with larger populations by the time you start looking at it. Can be controlled, so glyphosate, dicamba will suppress it or can kill it. Generally, you may need to go in with one of the residual herbicides, so the Reclaim, Restore, True Range can be managed by tilling, but that doesn't often fit into pasture control for a lot of people. Deep-rooted, hard to pull, hard to dig, and not grazed by cattle or horses, so not palatable. Brush control, I was just going to touch on a couple of things. Often for our area, some of the big problem on pastures and rangelands tend to be the western snowberry or buckbrush. It's not a noxious weed. It's more of a native plant that takes over and outcompetes. Snowberry spreads readily by rhizomes, especially where grazing has weakened competition, where you have less grazing. Will spread by seed, but very, very aggressive creeping root, and hard to spray. So the buckbrush does develop a waxy cuticle on the leaf. It seals itself in so it doesn't lose so much water, which gives it drought tolerance. So you generally want to spray early while it's actively growing. So after full leaf out, but before it starts to develop the waxy cuticle. So usually early to mid-July. Again, probably looking at, Reclaim, True Range, or Graze On for brush control. Up in our area, Graze On that's sort of its claim to fame, is that you can control snowberry. You can get suppression with 2,4-D or dicamba, so it's a little cheaper, but generally just sets it back for the year. Cattle don't graze it, it's unpalatable, so grazing management isn't a good control method. Mowing once a year won't control it. You can set it back. You'd need to mow, 2-3 times a year for several years to start to get control, and that gets trickier. I haven't heard too many people getting huge success with intensive grazing management. I think the best thing with this one is you want to get your control in place and then go with good grass management. Try to support a healthy, productive pasture or rangeland, and provide a lot of competition. And so sometimes, again, looking at some of the funding sources for, get into or improve a rotational grazing system, so to manage your rest and grazing a little more closely will work fairly well. May need to spray it and then, put in some of the grazing management. I've heard a few people that are looking at intensive grazing to remove it. Generally, where that's working with snowberry, we're talking extremely intensive grazing. So where you can basically take out all vegetation, including the brush, in 2 to 3 days at a maximum, but have a high enough stocking rate that everything is being grazed, and then move the cattle out and not put them back for 2 to 3 or 4 years to allow for recovery. And most operations don't have the desire or ability to put that kind of pressure on. I've seen some interesting management with bale grazing. Again, where on those pastures where you can set your bales and use winter bale grazing to get a fairly high stock density, fairly high physical impact on the site, plus the nutrient loading that comes from feeding on that, does tend to be suppressing or slowing it down. I don't think you'd ever necessarily get rid of it, but it tends to manage it. But again, only on those sites where bale grazing is really an option. The other one on on pastures that can be a problem is the poplar. And the poplar or aspen, again, This one, at least there is some palatability. So if you can concentrate cows on it in early summer, when it's fairly palatable, they will graze some of the poplar. Sheep or goats love it. So if you can get access to the sheep or goats while it's still short enough they can reach it, grazing management will work. Mowing works, but again, with aspen, any disturbance, whether it's grazing, browsing, or mowing, just tends to get it to sucker a little more quickly. So it tends to be repeated and regular work. Again, with this one, the graze on will, and probably reclaim will do some management as well if the herbicide control is what you're looking for. So that was basically sort of what I had for for information on the brush control. So I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. Caitlin, if you had some questions on their chat, or if anybody wanted to add them. Did put my contact information up if somebody wants to, give me a call, send me an email. I do pictures of weeds and have a pretty good crew for ID as well.